it's very important that people understand that as a result of the cuts made by other countries last year, 4 million people are now said to be facing famine in Yemen. That's in a total population of 24 million, 18 million people dependent on humanitarian aid for survival. Today, the announcement has been made by a number of countries about their plans for the next year. And it looks like the UN is about £2 billion short of what's needed. They asked for about £3.9 billion. They're only getting about, I think, 1.7 billion. And my understanding is that the Secretary General of the UN has described this as a death sentence. So it couldn't be more serious. And Britain has for a long time been a leader of humanitarian efforts, as your numbers indicate. But it's honestly inexplicable that this is the occasion to cut by half the amount of British aid for the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Just one final point by way of introduction. This isn't just about humanitarian policy. Britain, on the UN Security Council, is in charge of the Yemen file. And obviously, that puts it in pole responsibility for diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis, which now have a fighting chance, given the arrival of the Biden administration and its determination to have a different way forward. So from a British national interest, a British reputation point of view, as well as from the point of view of Yemenis who are desperately needing international help, this is a very sad day.
Well, just on that reputational point of view then from the UK, does it, and as you mentioned there with Boris Johnson chairing UN Security Council meetings, does it weaken the UK's moral authority?
Well, that's the great fear, I think, because Britain has had a very good record over the last 20 years or so on the global development and humanitarian scene. And the cuts in the aid budget are going to impact some of the poorest people in the world because British aid is efficiently delivered, effectively delivered, reaching the front line. As it happens, the UK has appointed, you're showing the pictures I can see, and they're the most heartrending pictures. Britain has actually made a priority under the Johnson government of fighting famine. It's got a famine envoy. Well, here's one of the world's 4 famine crises that are on the international scene at the moment. And the idea that it's the moment to cut aid in half, as I say, it's not just me who's saying it's inexplicable. I gather Jeremy Hunt, who was a successor of mine at the Foreign Office, he's also called it inexplicable and I think inexcusable as well. Andrew Mitchell, Conservative MP, former Development Secretary. This is where the rubber is hitting the road. And so Britain's reputation depends on our actions and our words being in sync.
Is it inexcusable, though, given that other countries are also cutting and COVID-19, even in hugely rich countries like the United Kingdom, is just devouring financial resources?
Well, my understanding is that Germany, for example, has actually increased its aid to Yemen today, I think to 200 million euros that they're spending. I haven't got the US figure yet, but judging by the comments of Secretary Tony Blinken, I think the US is increasing its aid to Yemen. Everyone understands that governments have their first responsibility on the home front, but the international aid to Yemen is an absolute fragment, a fraction of the extra borrowing that the Chancellor has rightly undertaken to save the British economy. And when it comes to famine abroad, Britain, the British people, have always been determined to save human life first. And that's what we're talking about here.
And just in terms of the overall situation in Yemen, in particular the war there, you mentioned the new Biden administration, the new Secretary of State, with a very different approach towards Saudi Arabia, towards the United Arab Emirates. Do you see perhaps a potential solution longer term coming from that route, pressure by the US on those participants in the war?
Yes, is the short answer to that. The US has announced an end to support for offensive operations by the Saudi-led coalition of which it's a part. It's also ended the attempted designation of the Houthi rebel movement as a global terrorist force. They control 80% of the country, and so you need to engage with them. But now we need 3 more things that we've discussed on your program over the years. First, a proper ceasefire so that the humanitarian aid can get going. Secondly, a proper accountability for the crimes that have been committed on all sides. Thirdly, an effective peace process. And there is a UN negotiator. He's British as it happens, Martin Griffiths. He needs to be able to get on with his job, because at the moment the country is not just facing famine, it's falling apart. And that is a political disaster in the making.